It is just about 6:05, so I'm going to go ahead and get started tonight. We'd like to be prompt and be considerate of your time. Again, my name is Tanya Havard-Dew from the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and I serve there as a Union Professional Issues Director. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedules to come out tonight and discuss with us or listen to us discuss the ways in which we will be reimagining assessment here in Illinois as we take a closer look at the Illinois State Board of Education's vision for mandatory state testing here in Illinois and the impacts of those proposed plans on the children, parents, educators, and educational stakeholders here in the state of Illinois. Our webinar tonight has been brought to you by the IFT, the Chicago Teachers Union, Illinois Families for Public Schools, the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, Raise Your Hand, and the Learning Disabilities Association of Illinois. So thank you all for joining us tonight. You can go to the next slide, please. Before we can begin, there is just a little housekeeping. On your screen, there should be a tab for you to select if you have interpretation needs. And we also invite you to drop your questions into the Q&A section of the screen there if you have a question you need an answer to. So please make sure to use those question and answer boxes. You don't have to wait until the end. We do have someone available to help you with that right now. So once again, welcome. And we are about to launch 2 poll questions for you so we can determine our audience tonight. So we would like to know who our participants are. So using the poll is in the middle of the screen, so I don't know that you can see the map of the state of Illinois. We are trying to determine what region of the state you belong in. So maybe we can relaunch the poll so everyone could get a peek at the map to determine where they are from in the state. And then we'll launch the poll again so we could get those answers. How about that? Does that work? Okay. All right. Well,
hey, Tanya, you can also click and hold on that survey and just pull it over to reveal the map.
Okay. Okay. Well, is the poll still active? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So we have a poll up. We'd like to know what area of the state you are from, and you can also tell us your role in the state of Illinois. Are you a teacher, a parent, a stakeholder, a support staff? Let us know that information right now. How long do we have for each poll?
I'm inclined to say another 15 to 30 seconds.
Okay, very good.
Number 8 is Chicago. Someone just asked in the chat.
Okay. Thank you, Nathan. All right, you guys should be wrapping up the poll, and are we going to display the results to see who's here? All right, a great majority of you, the majority of you are from Chicago. Welcome. And the majority of you are also pre-K to 12 educators. So welcome you all. So next slide, please. So we're all aware of COVID-19 and the disparate impacts of COVID-19 on educational schools, educational settings. And what we had hoped would happen when the Biden administration came in was that they would put a pause on testing for this year. We could bring in the next, thank you, put a pause on the federal testing mandates for this year, but they did not. What they did, however, was allow states to apply for waivers, but a full testing waiver was not given in Illinois. And but Illinois was allowed to make some changes, which included districts were allowed to change testing windows. They could conduct their testing in the spring versus the fall. There were a few tests and requirements that were eliminated. So there was no PSAT for 9th and 10th graders, and the SAT requirement for 12th graders was eliminated or waived. And accountability ratings and penalties for less than 95% participation were also eliminated. So we do have one question for you all right now, another poll question, and that is, how do you feel about testing in this current context? We'll give you a few more seconds to answer that one. Okay. Close the poll and look at the results. Yes, a lot of you are, the majority, 94% of you say that there's just way too much testing going on. Nobody thinks there's not enough. There's just too much testing going on in the state of Illinois. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. So this matters to us because it could reshape the way that teaching and learning goes on in the state of Illinois for the next 10 years. Next slide. So tonight, what we plan to discuss are ISBE's request for sealed proposals. We're going to talk about the questions and the problems using our experiences. We're going to talk about reimagining our assessment system towards a better future and the actions that we can all take to ensure that testing occurs in a manner that is acceptable for all students across the state of Illinois. So just a little bit about ISBE's request for sealed proposals, or RFSP. So what basically happens in this process is that ISBE is seeking services or products, and they have a specific budget that they have to have met in order to get the services that they need. So in this case, ISBE is looking for a vendor that can provide them with an assessment that consists of 3 state-mandated interim assessments for grades 3 through 8. These tests will replace our current Illinois Assessment of Readiness, or IAR, and will include 3 high-stakes test scores that will roll into 1 summative score at the end of the year. Now, districts are allowed to choose which standards will be tested at each interim, and it will also include state-funded testing for K through 2, which will be optional for districts, and it includes Spanish language testing. The part that is most troubling for us is that all of the proposals that are being requested by ISBE are to the tune of $228 million, nearly $228 million are the anticipated costs for this new request for sealed proposals being sought by ISBE, and that is over and beyond the funding that has already been allocated by the state for testing.
So I'm going to take over here. My name is Monique Riddell-Smith. I am also a member of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. I am the Director of Professional Issues. And so the section that we're going to go over now is really talking through some of the problems and questions about this proposal, and also talking about the rationale that ISBE is giving regarding why they believe this is the proposal that they should put forth. So if we go to the first slide. The first thing that they are saying, that the state is saying, is that this will actually reduce testing. So many of you already talked about how there's way too much testing in Illinois. The state is saying, well, this proposal is going to reduce testing because the IAR, the Illinois Assessment of Readiness, will eventually be eliminated. But the reality is that, first of all, Illinois has a contract with Pearson for the IAR until 2025. So if this current plan goes through, we will have simultaneously these 3 interim assessments, state-mandated interim assessments, and the IAR happening at the same time. And at one point, 20% of districts will be doing both of them. The next point about this that's important is that, actually, can we just go back? Yep, that's fine. That while the IAR will eventually be eliminated in 2025, we are essentially replacing that 1 high stakes test with 3 high stakes tests, because the fall, winter scores will all roll into 1 summative score. So this means that we're going to have high stakes testing. Each one of these tests are going to be high stakes because all of the scores count towards your final summative score. So that means high stakes testing every 10 to 12 weeks, right? Not only does that mean a loss of instructional time when the tests are being administered, but because of the high stakes, there'll be tremendous pressure to test prep before each test administration. And we can even stay at the last slide. And the pressure that these tests create to push up the scores, right? Just think about that stress, that level of toxic stress in the time period that we are already in. Our students and our parents and our families and educators have experienced so much stress, instability, loss at this time, that now adding the toxic stress of interim testing every 10 to 12 weeks, just imagine what that is going to do to school cultures. And so to talk about that, we actually have a parent of children in Chicago Public Schools. And Chicago Public Schools is actually a school district that has used high stakes interim testing for the last number of years. So we have Lori Torres, again, who is a Chicago Public School parent. And so we just like you to talk to us, Lori, about the stress, about the trauma that these high stakes tests actually exact upon students and families.
First, thank you all for having me and for bringing awareness to what the state is planning for our kids. Like Monique says, I am a parent of 3 CPS kids, currently an 8th grader, a 6th grader, and a 4th grader. And I'm going to speak to you with regards to my 4th grader, who has struggled with the ideas of assessment and with assessments themselves since starting in CPS at kindergarten. Funny, not funny that you bring about the stressors. My now 4th grader, who, when he was in kindergarten, because of the level of impact these assessments were having, found himself in the principal's office more than once. And in one of those visits with the principal, simply stated, "It's okay. I want to be homeschooled anyway." At that point, the principal kind of looked at him, and when my husband and I showed up to the school, asked, "Where does he get that from? What does he know about homeschooling?" I was like, "Well, he knows he has friends who learn from home and they don't have to take all these tests." Socially and emotionally, the mental health of my son was impacted, and it still is. He started seeing a therapist in kindergarten. He still sees one. He, at the end of 2nd grade, after going through a battery of psychological assessments, was diagnosed with a behavior disorder. It impacts his learning, but it also impacts how he views himself. He knows that assessments put him on a track. He knew that early on. His older brother and sister do fine with assessments. He does not. It is just now that my son is going to get supports in school that will help him, not only with his mental health concerns, but with his concerns on how he will push things off, not because he can't do them, but because of how he views them in terms of value. And so as a parent, it is difficult for me to continue to see a very bright boy not see himself that way. And to think that the state is going to somehow transition to more testing it leaves me without words. I know what my son goes through. I know what we have to do at home to get him through. And it's not a way to use the way in which schooling should be. We have too many high stakes assessments already. And then we have assessments that, as teachers, the idea of driving instruction, I don't drive my work. My kids, I'm a teacher as well, and so I understand and I see what kids go through and how kids feel about these tests. This year, my son was given the opt-out opportunity, and he definitely took it. I don't know. For someone like me who is both a parent and a teacher in the system, I see it in my classroom and I see it at home. And we need to do better in terms of how we measure growth in kids. Measuring them and comparing them one to another, when realistically speaking, in our district, we have what the state says we have to do, we have what the city says we have to do, we have what the federal government says we have to do. And all of that means that our kids lose so many hours of actual instruction that they'll never get back. So the idea of learning loss for one, the idea that learning loss is what came up during a pandemic, but we don't have that same conversation when we put all these assessments in front of our kids is laughable. We're hurting our kids. And so if we can get in front of what the state intends to do and make changes that make sense, then I need to do what I can. I mean, 10 years from now, my fourth grader will be out of the system. But what happens between now and then is where my worry is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori, for that testimony. Again, Tanya started us off by putting us in today's context, right? That we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And that even as we, kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel of this, the impacts of what we have experienced and what our students have experienced the last 15 months, the trauma, the loss, the instability, those effects are going to be long lasting. So even if we are back in school come the fall, for those of you who have already been back in school, the effects are still there. These effects are going to impact us long after this year and next year. And so to Lori's point, we really do have to be thinking about how are we reimagining what assessment looks like. If this was not acceptable pre-COVID, it is definitely not acceptable moving forward. So we're going to move on to our next slide because it goes right to what Lori talked about as far as another rationale that the state is giving for why these tests are necessary. And they're saying that because of what we've experienced and because of the learning loss of the last year and a half, that these tests, especially having 3 of them, will help teachers drive instruction so that they can understand and identify the learning loss and the academic gaps. And so to Lori's point, the reality is that standardized tests should not drive instruction. It can inform instruction, but why are we using standardized tests to drive the instruction of non-standardized young people? Our young people have varying strengths. They have varying talents, right? So why are we using standardized tests with unique and dynamic individuals and young people? And if we think again about COVID did not have a standardized response on communities. It did not impact all communities in the same way. And so again, to have this be the way that we move forward is problematic. Because standardized tests, what they actually do with the standards, the learning standards, is break them down into discrete skills. And so they don't allow students to apply what they've learned. It doesn't allow them the opportunities to think deeply, but instead relegates the standards to these very discrete skills. But since the state is saying that teachers absolutely need this information in order for them to do their work, let's again talk to practitioners. Let's talk to teachers. And we have with us another teacher, Miss Edwina Holton, who teaches 3rd grade math. She's a veteran teacher. She's been a teacher for 24 years. And for 19 of those years, she's taught in what we call the benchmark grades, right? The testing grades. And so, Ms. Holton, if you would just give us your experience about the limits of this test data, what test data is able to do and not do when it comes to helping you inform your instruction.
You're muted, Ms. Holton.
I'm sorry. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to be a little rough on your ears and rough on my throat. I caught a little laryngitis, so I'll try to be a little quick. So from this slide, as I was asked to talk about this point, I thought about 3 high stakes tests in my classroom throughout the years that's coming. And I'm thinking that during a high stakes test, we take time out from our schedules and our curriculum from our districts to stop and try to reiterate and go over those standards that we need the kids to try to apply for these tests. And I just couldn't imagine having to do that 3 times a year and losing more information or more time that I need to spend with my children to get them caught up basically to where they actually need to be before when they got to me. So I was just thinking of the time loss that I would have to use to get these kids caught up to just testing, and then looking at test 2 and test 3, those standards are not even going to be covered again. So I'm just going to go on with what I prepared to talk to you guys about. So from an educator's point of view, I just see this as an opposite matter. It will not help me drive my instruction because the information that I get back will not be used on the next test. I'm not going to get informative information of what my kids can do, how they're processing the information that's needed, which is key for helping me review the skills that they're lacking in. To be effective in the classroom, it's important that I have a clear understanding of my students' thinking. And the data that I receive from these tests are limited, and they don't provide the information that I need to help me further my instruction, to go back and reiterate what I need them to understand or accomplish for the next grade. I think that having high stakes tests is a stressor on the kids. They don't understand what high stakes tests mean, especially in early grades I teach third grade. So this is their first time taking the test. They're not mature enough to understand that this goes toward something. So when I tell them that they're testing, along with the district test that we have, and along with my assessments that I have, when they hear tests, they just hear tests. So it's not a serious matter. So I can't imagine that 3 tests put together would give us a greater outcome of what we were already lacking in. I'm looking for growth, and I don't think that a test given 3 times a year on different standards would show me what I know I can teach my kids, and I know what the state standards say they need to know. So if a district is allowed to continue to pick the standards that we're going to test on, how does that go back to teach, to help me identify what they did not get? When I think about testing in the fall, and I get kids that are already below, I can't imagine that tests would have any kind of indicator of where they could go from winter to spring. We have kids that are already 2 and 3 years below level. So if I teach them, or if they come to me not knowing, if I get them a little ways to where they need to be, I think I've accomplished my job. I can't imagine that giving them these 3 tests and having parents not understand what they mean, and not having the children understand what they mean, would guide us to a growth in knowledge and student success. Teachers have to stop and prep for these tests. And my tests take about 2 to 3 weeks to give. That's 2 to 3 weeks to give the test. That's 1 to 2 weeks to prep for the test. And that's every 10 weeks. And I don't think it would be beneficial for the outcome of what we're looking for our kids to have. And that's just growth. That's also stability. It's also letting them feel comfortable in, excuse me, letting them feel comfortable in what they can be successful in. So again, I think that we ought to reconsider or try to find another way to measure our students besides state testing. I understand that accountability is a factor, but when we take the students, we ought to realize that they're just not numbers that we get back from a state test that's saying you met or you didn't meet, and they don't know what they met or didn't meet. So that's all I have to say. And I hope that was helpful and beneficial.
Thank you so much, Ms. Holton. We appreciate you being with us, even though you're not feeling well. So thank you just so much for that really impactful testimony as well. Again, I think you really spoke to a couple of things. One, these tests don't show how students are processing information. It doesn't show how students are thinking through things. And that is what teachers need in order to be able to help students, in order for them to really be able to be effective.
Can I also say that we as teachers have, and I can't speak for everyone's district, but as a teacher, we have our own scope and sequence that we are mandated to follow as well. We have weekly assessments that we have to give the kids in reading and math. We have quarterly assessments that we have to give the kids to turn into our districts. Then we have our district testing. And I just think it'd be a great impact on saying where it's such a conflict on you putting all this on the teachers to say that the district wants you here, but the state needs you to get ready for the test. And then when we go back for round 2 and 3, and we have a whole different level of standards being tested, I don't have time to go back and review or to help close the gap of what you didn't know from the fall testing. So I just don't see how we're just on I just see us on a hamster wheel, spinning our wheels, and we're never going back to say, we tested you, now how can we close this gap since you don't know or if you didn't get this concept. If I'm still pushing on for my second test to say, now we're just going to test you on this, and here's spring, now we're just going to test you on this, and they're never going to be, remediated or given the opportunity to say, I didn't get it, let's go back and review. So I'm not understanding the whole concept of just more and more and more testing when I don't have time for more and more and more teaching because the testing is cutting out on my teaching. I can't test you on something I didn't get an opportunity to teach you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And not just the amount of, and the quality of the teaching as well, right? Like we are teaching for test prep, right? Not teaching for deep and meaningful learning, but literally teaching for the next test. And so if we move to the next slide, thank you again, Ms. Holton. The state is again saying that these through-year tests will improve student achievement because it'll save 70% of Illinois districts money because the Illinois districts will no longer have to pay for these interim tests that Ms. Holton, Ms. Torres have just talked to us about, that the district won't have to pay for that testing anymore because the state will now be mandating it, and so the state will be paying for it. But the reality of that is that, as Tanya told us at the beginning, there is still going to be $228 million almost spent on this effort. And actually, there's no evidence that these interim tests even improve student achievement, right? Just sit with that. And to really go over that with us, we have Dr. Paul Zawikowski, who's a former teacher, a former principal, and is also an academic researcher who has been doing research on assessments for the last few decades. And so, Dr. Zawikowski, if you can just really talk to us about what does the research say regarding this interim testing, regarding the type of plan that ISBE is proposing?
Thanks, Monique. I'll just take a couple minutes here to share a little bit of research with you. The key stories here are, of course, the ones that are coming from parents and teachers. First, just a reminder that interim testing really didn't take off in this state to get anything close to those 70% of Illinois districts who are currently using interim tests until after the Race to the Top initiatives that occurred back in 2010, 2011, and para legislation that called for increased use of student learning growth information to support principal and teacher evaluations. So even though there were many people that were skeptical at that time that interim assessments would make a difference, many felt like it was a very promising idea, and certainly lots of school leaders, superintendents, and principals saw value in being able to have percentile ranks for growth and attainment that they could match up with how teachers were doing, how their districts were doing, how their schools were doing. So in 2010, it looked like a promising idea, at least to some, but we're now in 2021, and we've now had a very large number of independent studies done on the impact of interim assessments nationally. And And not one of those independent research studies has shown any evidence whatsoever that interim testing makes any difference at all in student growth or achievement, which is kind of astounding when you think about it. Not even one of those over a dozen studies. More recently, in some research that we've been involved in Illinois, when you attach interim assessments to high stakes assessment, there's also a growing amount of evidence that that actually has a negative impact on student growth and achievement, not just no impact at all, but a negative impact. So when we hear from the state that 70% of districts will save money on this because the state will pick up the tab, you got to ask the question, why would we want to save districts money at the expense of wasting $228 million of state money in order to support testing that we have no evidence will actually work? I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that when you actually look at the way that outsourced standardized interim assessments report information, you see a common theme. And that common theme is that the information is reported as though curriculum were really not much more than a giant collection of discrete skills that students need to learn over time, and those skills just get more difficult over time. We all know that that's not what curriculum is really about. Certainly those skills are important, certainly content information is important, but the ability to apply those skills, the ability to transfer those skills to new situations is not only what's important for learning, but it's also what gives you higher scale scores on standardized tests. And so a key answer, there are many answers, why it is that interim tests aren't producing results, but right at the top of the list, I think, is that the way interim test information is reported back to teachers and districts actually misrepresents what standardized tests are actually assessing, which is not only kids' understanding and mastery of discrete skills and content information, but their ability to apply those skills and content information in unique contexts. So thanks for the opportunity to share this information. Really appreciate being here.
Thank you, Paul. That's really powerful to know that this amount of state money is being proposed, and yet there's no evidence to show that they do what they're being proposed to do. And so our next point actually still gets at that, right? Because the state is saying that this is an equity issue. And in that, they're right. It absolutely is. The state is saying that they are promoting equity by making sure all districts have access to interim tests. The problem with that, though, as Paul has just outlined, is that the tests are ineffective in increasing student achievement and attainment. And so the state is also saying that this proposal will allow us to understand and address learning loss, particularly among Black and Brown students. And so that's why it's also an equity issue. But the fact of the matter is that the communities that are going to feel the most pressured to increase their test scores are going to be these Black and Brown communities that traditionally don't do well on standardized testing. And so the curricula is going to be relegated, as we've talked about, to this one skill at a time instruction, to this remedial type of instruction, which actually impedes deep, meaningful learning. That is the kind of instruction that we need, particularly in Black and Brown communities, but these standardized high stakes texts are actually going to impede that. So if we're going to talk about equity, we're absolutely right that we need to be centering those who are our most marginalized. So thinking about what will this plan or proposal, what will be the impact on Black and Brown students and communities? What will be the impact on our special education students, as Ms. Torres talked about? What will be the impact on our English language learners? And we're going to get to someone who's going to talk to us about that, but just think about what has the impact been for those populations pre-COVID. Standardized testing has not gotten us closer to equity. In fact, the impacts on Black and Brown communities, we have seen school closings, we have seen the push out of Black teachers. And so this high stakes standardized testing regime has not brought equity. It has narrowed the curriculum. At this point in time, we need more of our students to be engaged in curricula that is culturally relevant, that really addresses some of the real issues that we are facing as a society. This type of instruction will impede that. So if we have $228 million, Why are we not putting that towards things that we know will provide real equity? Things like smaller class sizes, things that have been shown through the research to positively impact student achievement and attainment, more clinicians, more Black and brown teachers, right? So to help us even more with this point about how this will impact our special education students, our English language learners, and we have another practitioner with us, an 8th grade teacher, Erin Beignet, who's going to speak to us about what these tests, again, actually do to curricula and how they impact some of our most marginalized students. So Erin, thank you.
Thank you, Monique, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Let me just check to make sure I'm off mute. You can hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. Like Monique said, I'm a 7th, 8th grade math teacher. I've taught special education math in Chicago for the last 10 years. And when I came on in the district, it was right when we were transitioning from focusing all of our attention and making t-shirts for the ISAT test, to get everyone pumped up for the ISAT test every year, to transitioning to our focus on this interim based assessment with NWA. Put aside the accountability metrics that CPS used with NWA and the interim testing. I want to speak to you all about my experience just giving a high stakes test to students 3 times a year, and what that data looks like when we take those tests and what we can actually do with them. So here's a sample. Here's a sample of a score report that just part of a report that I get on one of the 3 times we took this test every year. We would get a list of our students and where they lined up in these little score brackets for each of the different content areas of math. I was a teacher of math, so this is a math report. So you could see, you have one student in the 201 to 210 range, which is aligned to 2nd grade, but then also you have 8 of your students in 221 to 230, they're right in developing range. Then you have the 251 to 260, they're in high school range, in all these different areas. So these tests told us that we have all these wide range of capabilities in our class, and that we needed to attend to them. And it got even more granular than that with this assessment data. We would get these reports on an individual student basis. Then, I work for schools where the admin told us that we need to sit down with the students and go through the list, communicate it to parents, and really gauge our instruction based on these reports from the interim assessment, which, like our previous speakers were talking about, our a laundry list of discrete skills. So one student would be told that they need to develop these 40 to 50 skills. Like, these are the skills, if you want your student to grow, if you want to get that next growth score in our test regimen, that you need to attend to these long list of skills, and you can't see them, but I wanted just to show you they're so small on their screen, but I wanted to show you the long list that we had to attend to. I remember having binders as a teacher and highlighting everything I needed to do in this quarter and this week. And so, you can do a couple things as a teacher, as a school. When you get all of this data, you can double down on it and say, okay, we want to attend to these accountability metrics, and we want to make sure our students grow on the test, which a lot of schools have to do in order to get their school rating up, and to keep funding rolling in, keep students in their school. So they have to attend to this data. And you would really have to gauge all of your instruction to meet this huge, wide range of skills in your classroom. Or you could say that, I'm just going to grit and bare my teeth and give this test and then not worry about it later, and hope for the best in the spring. But I've worked for both types of schools, and the former is the one that's alarming, and the one that has really shaped a lot of teaching and learning in Chicago in really harmful ways, because of this huge having to attend to all of this data that you're getting on a constant basis throughout the year. Students were ended up tracked by scores. I know of elementary schools, and have been a part of elementary schools, where we didn't even group kids by grades. We grouped them by RIT bands so that they would move from class to class and just address those skill levels. And how, and looking back on how harmful that was to students, it's terrible. We were, you see these classroom data walls across Chicago. I hope they're going away, but it's because this test was so central and so front of mind because it's given 3 times a year that students would see their student ID correlated to a chart on the board, letting them know what their score is and how they measured up in terms of if they're above grade level or below. I've worked for schools where they've made you write the goal score for a student on the back of their ID, or you write it on their desk so that they always know. I've worked. I've heard of admin, walking up to students and saying, "What's your goal score?" And if the student didn't know the goal score, then it was a ding on the teacher, and that means you needed to sit down and tell your students, what their goals were and what they're actually here to accomplish. Curriculum no longer became these units of studies. You pretty much did not see any standards-based curriculum that was being delivered on a consistent basis because you had to attend to the data that we were getting was telling us that we needed to teach, hundreds of skills. In the end, social studies became a reading class, science became a math class, gym didn't happen anymore, music didn't happen anymore, art didn't happen anymore because it was all geared. We were, gearing towards these tests. And, this happens in general with standards by tests, but I can't stress enough how particularly terrible and harmful high stakes interim testing is, because it's not happening once in the spring. It's happening in the fall, the winter, and the spring, and it's always right around the corner. It's always at your grade level team meeting with admin. It's always central in your conversation with parents for report card pickups because it becomes all consuming. And in the end, students internalize it, and that's the most heartbreaking thing of this whole thing. That my students, because of being in a system from 3rd through 8th grade where they were told a score 3 times a year, they know their score. They know their peers' scores. They know that correlates to their high school, and that's why they're there. And the thought that this is going to happen statewide, and just when CPS seems like they're going to drop it, that we're going to get this coming at the state level is just alarming. In general, like testing 3 times a year on a school stops IEP services for 3 times a year. As a special ed teacher, I would be delivering accommodations and modifications for this test because I had to individually read the test to students because my students, deserve that accommodation and I want to set them up for success. But that means I was pulled out of class for 2 weeks, 3 times a year, and that's a minimum. And that means I wasn't co-teaching with my general ed teacher. So all of those students who were supposed to be getting co-teaching minutes were not getting them. And it's just a huge waste of resources and, borderline illegal in delivering the education that all of our students deserve. Any units of study were halted 3 times a year. Teaching planning time became data digging time where you would go through this granular data and come up with plans. That was pretty much all of our professional development when NWA was at the height of what we were focusing on. And in the end, whenever you started to get momentum with your class and routines and discussion routines or problem solving routines, it was just chopped short every time we took the test because you had to get ready for it. And I will tell you, these tests look great when they say, oh, it's just a 50 to 60 minute test and 3 times a year. But if anyone's given a standardized test, it doesn't take 50, 60 minutes. And you know that if you give it on a Wednesday and Thursday, that Monday and Tuesday are prepping and Friday's a waste. And then that doesn't even take into account, all of the special educators and what they have to do in a school to deliver high stakes tests. I'm worried about this. I'm worried about this going at a state level. And I'm willing to, continue to, build a coalition with you all to hopefully make sure that this does not happen at a larger level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it on over. You just laid that out so beautifully. And now we're going to talk about how it's going to impact even our youngest learners, so that there's now a foot in the door on testing of our K-2. So Kathy, you can take it from here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Mannon, also one of the Union Professional Issues Directors at the IFT. And as Monique said, this new state plan includes a very specific impact on, like Monique said, our youngest learners. And that is that districts can decide to add these interim tests to K-2 classrooms. Right now, testing is required by the state starting at grade 3. And there, of course, could be a lot of incentive for districts to want to add K-2 testing, even if it's so-called optional. There's first of all, the state's paying for it. So why not take advantage? And we know that high stakes tests start in grade 3. And so let's test our K-2 students to see if they're going to be ready for the high stakes tests in grade 3. And that's very troubling. Standardized tests, we know, are developmentally inappropriate for our early learners. And just like in the upper grades, it does restrict curricula. There will be pressure to narrow the curriculum so that it is more tailored towards the test, which will replace play and play-based learning, which we know is so incredibly important for young learners. Play is work to them. That's how they learn. And it actually directly conflicts with Senate Bill 654, the Right to Play Every Day bill, which passed the General Assembly this past legislative session and has been sent to the governor for his signature. This particular bill would require public schools to provide 30 minutes of daily playtime for all students in kindergarten through 5th grade. And so the message from the General Assembly obviously is that play matters, but this plan is in direct conflict with that idea. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of outstanding questions with regard to this plan. Whether or not states will actually prohibit districts from adding additional standardized tests. We know that there are a lot of districts across the state that do their own local tests as a way to prepare for the high stakes tests. And it's not clear whether or not that would actually be prohibited. How will districts choose standards? Who will have input on those decisions? Will educators be part of that decision making? Will parents and students be part of that decision making? And what subject areas might be sacrificed in order to really focus on language arts and math test preparation? We know that curriculum is not compartmentalized. If reading comprehension standards are selected for the fall, we know reading comprehension is not only taught in the fall. That's something that carries all the way across the year. And so what will that actually do to classroom teaching and learning? We don't know what would happen to students who move school districts. Or how growth can be measured if there are different standards chosen at different points in the year. And of course, continuing just to think about the pressure that there will be on teachers to teach breadth and not depth. And another question is really, what is the cost to ISBE, the agency, to administer 3 high stakes tests instead of 1? The questions that come to the agency that they are fielding, reporting testing irregularities, ensuring that the data that gets uploaded is correct. There are all kinds of impacts there that just really don't seem to have been considered. So we do have one more poll question for you about testing. Wait to see that get launched. So we've talked about a lot of problems with this state plan. And so what we want to know from you is, what about this testing plan is most concerning to you? How would you, what would you prioritize as the top concerns? And let's maybe keep the poll open for another 10 to 15 seconds. A lot of choices there to read through. All right, does it look like we're in a good place to close the poll? So as we look at the results, the concern that rises to the top, more learning time lost to state testing and district school test prep. That has definitely been a big focus of many of our presenters this evening. And it looks like adding developmentally inappropriate K2 testing, interim tests competing with curriculum, and the narrowing of the curriculum also rise to the top with a lot of concern. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts with us about what is most concerning to you.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Alsop with the Illinois Federation of Teachers. Before that, I was a high school English teacher in Granite City, Illinois, and I'm here to talk through some timelines with you all. And to go back to the poll that you all called out, one of the biggest concerns you see is the increased amount of time for state testing and test prep. And you're drawing attention to a really important distinction to make, that there are local decisions about testing and there are state decisions about testing, and that those two work hand in hand and have very significant impacts on teaching and learning and on kids every day. And, so this timeline that Erin's going to show you in a couple seconds here is a possible school year with the state's 3-test model, the 3 high-stakes tests, what this would look like for grades K through 8. So understand, this timeline is founded on the belief that the State Board of Education will not mandate districts stop prohibiting locally administered standardized tests. Because Illinois is a local control state, the state would be very hesitant to take that on and say districts can't give local tests, districts can't test prep. So this timeline envisions a local decision to conclude test prep. So what you see there is in August and September, locally districts are getting ready for those tests, just like Ms. Holton talked about earlier. And by September and October, we have an interim test 1 happening, grades 3 through 8, optional K2 test starting, and then the mandatory kids kindergarten survey is also kicking in. And as that wraps up, we see more local test prep occurring to get ready for the next interim test in October through December, so that by January, we're doing another round of state testing, not just for 3 through 8, but potentially that optional K2 testing. And like Kathy said, the state can call it optional, but if the state's paying for it and districts recognize that this is going to help get third graders ready, as Ms. Holton talked about, third graders coming in suddenly in this high stakes environment, is it really optional? So then we come to February, more local test prep happens. Districts can choose to add a second kid survey for kindergartners. It's not required, but they can. So that brings us into March, when not only do we have the science test, which was required for grades 5, 8, and 11. But this is when the state also requires the dynamic learning maps to begin, which is for a small population of students with disabilities who are not able to take the interim 3-test model. And we also see access testing beginning. This is the test for English language learners. And, keep in mind, this request for sealed proposals that we've been talking about this evening doesn't impact the science test, DLM, or access. Those tests remain as they are in their current state of development or implementation. So any concerns that you might have with access, particularly as it relates to being administered to students with disabilities, all of those will continue. There's nothing in this plan from the state to address those issues. So we get through March with all of that testing, and then we roll back into March and April with more local test prep activities, which takes us to May. with the third interim test in late April, early May, the optional K2 test if districts decide they're going to do this state test, more access testing, more dynamic learning maps, and potentially the science test continuing. And by the time we get to the end of May and kids and teachers feel tested more than anything else, there's still the option for districts to add the kids survey for a third time. And, I think it's important to note, this model is what we envision, with local decision-making tracking with what we've seen happen in public schools for the last 20 plus years. And what we see missing in this timeline is really when teachers and students find time to experience the joy of learning, the time for play, and for teachers to have the joy and satisfaction of developing meaningful real-world lessons that can engage students in their learning and think critically, do projects, really engage with their world. All of that is missing in a state timeline that just envisions more testing, not less. And to make this even more concrete, let's think about just a fifth grader's testing calendar, which is what Erin's going to put up for you now. If we think about the year in the life of a fifth grader and a fifth grader's school testing calendar, the months of a school year, Erin's going to pop up now. All of the months in pink are when state testing potentially can occur. And if you look at this and you think about a fifth grader who also happens to be an English language learner, not only do, they're testing March, April, and May. We're looking at more months doing state tests than not doing state tests. And as Erin talked about, the whole calendar and the whole school schedule gets disrupted to accommodate these state tests, because we know not every school has the facilities to have one-on-one computer devices for each kid. So schedules are disrupted, and more focus is given on that, and other services are just left to the side. So with all of that information in mind, let's really think about what can we do, right? That's where we are. How did we get to this point? And if Erin will go to the next slide for us, to provide you with some context about what we can do, I will say this. It certainly appears to us that the state superintendent is determined to rush through board approval of this request for sealed proposals. By the end of the school year, when families or teachers are busy, we first got wind of this in April of 2021, when the state superintendent put this before the State Board of Education. Her original intent was to have a vote in May to release this request for sealed proposals. There was some concern by state board members in May, and they asked for further information. They asked for her to work with the state board's Technical Assistance Commission, which is a group of psychometricians who advise the state on testing. They asked her to reach out to the State Assessment Review Committee, which is a statewide group of practitioners, to provide greater input. And so where we are now is that state board members have raised questions, testing experts have raised questions, practitioners have raised questions since this RFSP came forward in April. But the vote didn't happen in May, and by all indications, we are still hearing that the intent is that this vote will happen in June, right? The next state board meeting is June 16th. There are potential allies on that state board. There are some state board members who have raised concerns about the substance of the plan. They've also raised concern about how the process has been rushed. Because if you look at this timeline with a June vote potentially on this request for sealed proposals, the state superintendent really hopes to have this vendor identified by late summer or early fall of this year. That's the goal, with the intent that the state is going to pilot these new 3 interim tests starting in next school year. So I think Erin's going to click for me one more time so you kind of get this visual of how these contracts are going to run. The old vendor contract with Pearson for the Illinois Assessment of Readiness remains in place through 2025, right? So the new contract is actually going to begin in, the superintendent hopes, early fall of 2021. So we have these years of overlap where the state's paying 2 different vendors for state tests. And from all indications, what we understand is that during school years 2022 through 2025, the state's going to start piloting these new tests while still offering and requiring IAR. And at this point, we're really looking at, from what the state has indicated, 1 in 5 school districts are going to be required to give both tests during these overlapping years when the state has 2 different contracts. From there, pending that the state gets approval from the U.S. Department of Education, their hope and their timeline is that by fall 2025, IAR will go away and that they will be able to begin using these 3 state tests, these 3 high stakes interim state tests statewide by 2025. And their intent is also that by 2026, 2027, when the tests have been around and in place for a few years, they can go back and renew that contract with the vendor, which is how we get to the number Tanya showed you way back at the beginning, that $250 million in additional state funds. That's where that money is going, is to stretch out these tests and make them a permanent fixture for at least the next decade in public schools in Illinois. And, you know, as I said before, we do have some state board members who are raising questions and are offering concerns about it. But keep in mind, this would have been voted on in May if families and teachers and their unions had not been speaking out about this and raising concerns. For this to be changed, for us to have a more meaningful and sane approach to state testing in Illinois, the state board and the state superintendent need to hear from all of you and from all of us in the state, because that's what's going to make a difference. You know, we had teachers and parents speak to the state board in May and to a board committee meeting on June 1st that was powerful and that really raised more questions for the state board. And that's what we need to do. We need to keep the message up to let the state board and especially State Superintendent Carmen Ayala hear from all of you. The state board is going to meet again on June 16th. Like, that's the box to put in red there on the slide. At this point, we don't have any indication that there won't be a vote on June 16th. And if there's not a vote on June 16th, it will be down to all the work we do to prevent this from happening. Because what the state board and the state superintendent need to know from all of us is this is not the way to go. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Monique Rideau-Smith to talk about some specific concrete actions we can all take to try to bring some sanity to state testing and turn the state away from this plan.
So thank you, Amy, so very much for that and really giving us an outlook about what this will look like for students and for educators and for families. We have been wrapped up in this high stakes testing culture for the past 20 years. And so it's sometimes difficult to think about the fact that there is another reality that's possible. We can have a balanced assessment system. We can create a humanizing assessment system, not a testing system, an assessment system that actually engages students, that prepares them to tackle real life problems, right? Think about what we are going through in our society. We have real life issues. We have a global pandemic. We have white supremacy and white supremacist violence. We need our young people to be prepared and using their creativity, their ingenuity, and their academic literacies to tackle these real world problems, right? That should be the curricula that we are teaching. So there are examples of districts across the country who have designed assessments and design assessment systems where the assessments are embedded within culturally relevant critical curriculum. So they're not disconnected. They're not these isolated skills that teachers are prepping their students with, or that students are taking these discrete skill type tests every 10 to 12 weeks, but they are using the assessments that are embedded in the curriculum that are tied to what they are learning every day. And so standardized tests are not driving the curricula, but informing it. And it's possible for us to create such a state. It's possible for us to create such a system like that, but it's incumbent upon us to invest the time and the resources needed to do it. And so we have the resources because we know we have $228 almost $1 million that we can invest in this kind of balanced assessment system. So we can move to the next slide. Thank you. What do we need to do? There are a couple of things that we need to do. First, we need to make sure that we stop this vote. So down in the chat, we're going to have a link where you can actually write the ISBE board, and we're going to give you time to actually do that. To put in your name, it only takes about literally like 1 minute, right? To write the ISBE board to say they should not be voting on this on June 16th. They have not engaged with the folks who are going to be directly impacted by this. They have not engaged with students who will be taking these tests. They have not engaged with families. They have not engaged with educators who are going to be responsible for administering these tests and for building their curriculum around it. They have not talked to the folks who will be directly impacted by this. So we need to write the board to let them know that they need to stop this vote. We'll also put in a link where you can share on social media, right? And tag ISBE to again say that you have not engaged with us. So you do not need to go through with this vote. And not only do we not want them to vote on June 16th, we don't want them to come back in August with this same proposal and bring it up for a vote. So it's not just about stopping the vote. It's also about we want a real process where our voices are heard, where ISBE actually engages with the folks who are going to be directly impacted, and that they are working with us to co-create a more humanizing assessment system, right? So I'm gonna give you just like a minute or two to actually write that letter to the board or to put in your information so that we can flood them with letters. There's also, if they do not call off the vote at the state board meeting on June 16th, there is public participation periods during those ISBE board meetings where the public, you and I, all of us, can make our voices heard there as well so that this board knows that we do not agree with this proposal. So again, I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds to look at some of that information. Hopefully it's been dropped in the chat. I got a thumbs up that it has. So please not only write your own letter and share on social media, again, share with other folks, get the word out. Because as Amy spoke about, without some pushback, this would have been decided already. So our voices do matter when we lift them all up. So we want to make sure that we are letting the board know loud and clear that we are not in agreement with this proposal and that we need a revised proposal. Beautiful. I see people in the chat saying that they have sent the letter. We thank you. We appreciate you for that. And we're also going to drop in another link because this is not, again, just about stopping this vote, but we also need to co-create a more humanizing assessment system. Amy talked about that there are 2 committees that are already in existence that are designed to weigh in on assessment. That is the Technical Advisory Commission, and there's also the State Assessment Review Committee, where there are practitioners on that board. We want to, as a state, come together, bring students, parents, educators together to create an assessment system that we believe will engage students and that will actually work in helping to inform the instruction of educators. We can create that. As I said before, districts across the nation are doing that. So we want to not allow ISBE to just come up with their own proposal because we've seen how that has gone. We need to get together and bring a proposal to them about what it is that we need in the state of Illinois. So another link was just dropped in the chat that if you want to join us in that statewide coalition of really thinking about in helping to design a new anti-racist, humanizing, justice-centered assessment system that is embedded in culturally relevant curricula, that engages students in real-world issues and problem-based learning. Please sign up, put your name down, and we will contact you and begin to work with you, begin to have working groups across the state so that, again, we can bring forth a community-driven proposal for what we want assessments to look like in Illinois. So I'm just giving you some time. We dropped in a lot of links. Hopefully you can, like Tara Stamps, get your letter in, share on social media, and sign up so that this summer we can be spending time designing, co-creating an assessment system that really does help our students to engage with learning, help educators to inform their instruction so that we can engage in really deep, meaningful learning. Our democracy is at stake. We need young people who are not just answering questions, multiple choice questions, but that are critiquing, analyzing, interrogating their reality, who are asking questions. And we can create that kind of assessment system. We can create that kind of learning, but we have to work at it. So we thank you for joining us tonight. Again, we'll leave those links in the chat. We hope that you will share this information. We know some of you have been putting in the chat that more families, more students, more educators need to know that this is happening. So we hope that you will be the ambassadors for getting this message out about what is proposed and what is planned, because another reality is possible.